And welcome to another edition of Hank Unplugged. This is the podcast, not the broadcast. I've been doing broadcasts for 30 years. I've only dipped my toe into podcasting, but this has been one of the most fruitful endeavors in my 30 years at the Christian Research Institute, because I've been able to bring some of the most interesting people in the world, some of the brightest people in the world to you, as we just have a conversation and you have the opportunity to listen in. One of the things that you can do as a listener to the podcast is to tell people about it. Share with people the significance of the podcast. Let people know where you're listening to the podcast. Obviously, you can subscribe on iTunes. You can listen to the podcast at equip.org or wherever you consume your favorite podcasts. I don't know how we can keep upping the ante, but that's precisely what we're doing. Every single week, we're talking to someone more interesting than the last week. And this is not to cast aspersions on anyone I've talked to, but this week is particularly interesting to me because this is a conversation with Benjamin Wiker. Now, he doesn't have many kids. I have 12. He only has 7. But other than that, he is a graduate from Furman University. He has an MA in religion. He has a PhD in theological ethics from Vanderbilt University. He's a senior fellow at the Veritas Center for Ethics and Public Life at the Franciscan University. He's director of human life studies at Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio. And he's published all kinds of very interesting books. One of the books that really caught my attention early on was A Meaningful World, but there are many others, and we'll talk about that on today's Hank Unplugged. It is an absolute delight to have you with us, Benjamin.
And I'm so glad to be back. I remember our interview in Meaningful World as one of the best I've ever engaged in. So when y'all invited me on, I was very excited. So this is a highlight, certainly of my week.
You know, when you talk about A Meaningful World, you're talking about a book, but that book underscores how the arts and the sciences reveal the genius of nature, and that's something that somehow or other has escaped our attention.
Yes, it's unfortunate. We live in a kind of a secularized, materialist-based culture, and that supposedly is undergirded by science. Science tells you that you live in a reductionist, materialist world, and hence there isn't any meaning in the universe. But that's just not true. When we actually look at the way that science carries on and the way that it uncovers layers and layers of complex intelligibility, you begin to realize, this couldn't have happened by accident. We don't live in a meaningless world. We live in a meaningful world. And we uncover those layers of intelligibility in every one of the sciences. So we're in this weird situation where everyone's telling us the science tells us there's no God and we live in a meaningless universe, but science is actually telling us if we shake off the shackles of that are binding our minds, that we live in a meaningful world and it's deeply intelligible and hence has to have an intelligent source.
You know, I just wrote a book called Muslim, What You Need to Know About the World's Fastest Growing Religion. It's not out till October 10th this year, 2017. But I want to talk to you a little bit about what's happening around the world. You seem to have your finger on the pulse of persecution. I've heard you point out that the greatest century for martyrdom was not the Roman centuries, but the modern centuries like the 20th and 21st centuries, and that in the 21st century alone, we have martyrdom of Christians at a rate of about 100,000 per year. And I think this is something that is in the blind spot of the West, and we need to talk about.
Yeah, it's you wonder how could that be happening yet be ignored, and there's a lot of strange causes of it. One of them is it's rather complex, but I'll try to boil it down, and probably you pick right up on that in your new book, which I will be very happy to read, by the way, your book on Islam. that there is a kind of built-in anti-Christian, pro-Muslim bias that's actually hundreds of years old. It goes back to the late 1600s to the original radical secularists in Europe who wanted to unseat Christianity, and they thought that Islam was actually a better religion. And so they were willing to believe everything good about Islam and everything bad about Christianity. And that sort of sounds like the secular left today. It doesn't sort of sound like it. That's how they are. They ignore any obvious bad news when it happens against Christians, and then they downplay anything bad that the Muslims do, and then they put a cheerful face on Islam, when at the foundation of it, it truly is antagonistic both to Christianity and to secular culture. So this is a very odd blind spot that I don't know how we can make it more obvious, but Christians need to make it known loud and clear that this is an age of martyrdom. It's one of the worst.
It is, and you think about how many Christians are being martyred in the Middle East. I mean, sometimes we think that North Korea is the greatest persecutor of Christians, but the greatest persecution of Christians seems to be rooted in Islamic countries.
Yes, and here's another aspect. Again, the secular left is quite loud, and rightly so, about the sin of slavery, and it thinks that it's only something that the Christian West did, and that's just not true. Islam is much more deeply embedded in slave trade, both in its entire history and up until now. And the greatest cause of slavery, well, there's two of them now. It's Islam, and then it's the sexual slavery in regard to pornography. And Islam is as you know, basically has reinstated a kind of sexual slavery, which we thought we had wiped out, but it's not true. It's right there, and again, they're ignoring that. How can they ignore that, or the way that women are treated generally? But again, it's this self-imposed blind spot. Christianity can't be better than Islam. That would undo our whole historical narrative, so they think.
Many people are celebrating 500 years of Reformation, but you make a connection between Islam and the Reformation.
Yes, I do, and somewhat like you, I have a book coming out in regard to that. I think it's going to be about the end of August. I think August 28th. It's called The Reformation 500 Years Later, 12 Things You Need to Know. And in that, the interesting thing we find out is that 500 years ago, the context of the Reformation includes literally the inflowing of Islam, the attack of Islam on the West, and that represented for those at the time period a kind of act of God. In fact, both Calvin and Martin Luther thought that was a direct punishment by God for the sins of the Roman Catholic Church, and they in fact looked favorably on Islam. This is more so Martin Luther than John Calvin, but Martin Luther actually said, well, Islam is actually in many ways superior to Christianity, and he even oddly enough was engaged in having a translation of the Quran published, and he put a preface to it. So he put a positive spin on Islam, and oddly enough, that reaffirmed the later understanding of Islam that the secular Enlightenment had. Islam is better than Christianity. So what we have is a strange kind of brew at that point where the Reformation is causing a different understanding of Islam. Prior to that, it was, this is a religion which is antithetical to Christianity, has been continually attacking it for hundreds of years. And it came to be seen as then somewhat, morally and somewhat religiously superior, and hence even a foil to use against Christianity.
If you fast forward, Benjamin, to today, and you think about how if we don't hang together, we'll hang separately, as has been well said. How important is it for us to have a conversation with the Protestant community, the Orthodox community, the Catholic community? How can we find commonality around the essentials? Because we're being attacked by illiberal liberalism. We have the onslaught of Islam, and we're in a very precarious position. Obviously, we're in that position because if we are not salt and light, pagans are going to exercise their job description, and we're going to be in the situation that we find ourselves in today. But talk about how unity, not at the expense of the essentials, is really critical for us to be looking forward to as Christians.
It is. It really is. And the 500th year anniversary of the Reformation, I believe that God is actually driving us back all together again, because as you say, all Christians are being persecuted by the secular left. All Christians are being persecuted by Islam. And I like to use the image, because I'm a big Tolkien fan, of the elves and the dwarves in Helm's Deep, and they've had this centuries-long antagonism to each other, and they can't get along, but they're driven into this castle because they're being attacked by a common enemy, and they learn to be friends. And, the dwarves don't turn into elves, the elves don't turn into dwarves, but they realize they have a common enemy, and they can have a common friendship based on some of the essentials. And we're in that situation today. Every Christian is under attack. And when Christians are under attack by Islam in the areas around the Holy Land and Syria and Iraq and so on, well, we're all under attack. It isn't those people over there, and it's all Christians. And all Christians were assaulted by communism in the 20th century. The communists didn't single out, we're just going to hit the Eastern Orthodox, or we're just going to hit the Roman Catholics, or we're just going to hit Lutherans. They were enemies to all Christians, and that should let us know we must have something if these people see us as their chief enemy. We must have something good in common. And while we don't want to override differences and say, hey, they're not essential, we can at least say if we aren't in this together, then we will all commonly be defeated. No one will win then.
How do you overcome the stereotypes, though? I mean, in the broader evangelical community, certainly in the dispensational community, the Roman Catholic Church is seen as the whore of Babylon that is depicted in Revelation chapter 17. I know when I converted to Orthodoxy, people didn't know what that was, but they were pretty sure they didn't like it. There's these stereotypes that are out there. How do you overcome that?
Well, whatever it is, it's got to be bad.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's one of the things, and I stress this in the Reformation 500 years later, everyone's got dirt. And there's a kind of humility if we can all realize that we've all made mistakes, Protestant, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and nobody is without sin, and hence, we really shouldn't be casting stones. And for heaven's sakes, if we're told by Jesus Christ to love your enemies, can't we even love our fellow Christians? If we have to have a battle, let it be one of charity. To outlove each other, as we might put it. So we do have to overcome those. And one of the things I do in the Reformation 500 years later is I have something there for everyone, a little humility pill. I do look at the popes, the really bad popes. Yes, there were really bad popes, and Catholics have to understand that. But I also look at very good popes, and Protestants have to understand that, and what they did that was important. I look at Martin Luther, warts and all, and there's a significant number of warts there. I look at the problems caused by different interpretations of Scripture once the principle of sola scriptura was embraced. So I think one of the things that we all need is humility, and that can be the beginning of saying, I'm not without sin. Again, I'm not going to cast the first rock, but I but I can reach out to my I can make Catholic friends and reach out. I can make Protestant friends, reach out to them. Eastern Orthodox, reach out to them. And we'll find that we have a lot more in common, especially when we're all under fire, than we have which divides us.
In Defense of Nature. I just read that book, the subtitle, The Catholic Unity of Environmental, Economic, and Moral Ecology. You've written a lot of great books, but this has to be at the top of my list. I mean, first of all, I love the subject. Secondly, I love the way you wrote this book. I mean, it's absolutely hilarious at some points, but what you do here is you're doing probably what's most needed today. You're pointing out that there is a way to bridge the gap between the left and the right so that we can have a meaningful dialogue.
Yes. And we're not having that now. That's the problem. And we can put the blame on both sides. The left is really good at seeing the awfulness of befouling nature. They get it. The problem is that they unite that with things that Christians find repugnant, usually morally repugnant, everything from gay marriage to, theologically repugnant, like some kind of either atheism or pantheism or some weird combination. So you've got something good there, the affirmation of nature as good and ordered, but something off, the belief that you can do anything you want to human nature and there isn't any moral foundation. Well, you find among Christians the opposite. You tend to find the opposite. They shy away from any questions on the environment because they think they're dipping a toe into pantheism or worse, and they simply want to embrace Christianity as a kind of moral theological set of moral theological doctrines abstracted from nature. Well, that's a weird situation to be in from the perspective, I know you know this from the history of Christianity, that's a heresy called Gnosticism. One thing that's essential to Christianity, obvious from the Incarnation, is that we're embodied beings, we're natural beings, we're created in the image of God, but we're animals, that is, we're rational animals, we're part of nature, but we also transcend nature, and the point of In Defense of Nature is to get the left and the right to see what the other side is saying that's true that you're rejecting. So get the left to see that there's a moral order to human nature. You just can't do whatever you want sexually, in the same way you can't do whatever you want to the environment. And the right, or Christians, have to see, wait a second, isn't there something in the Bible about the goodness of creation? Isn't there something in the Bible about how the beauty and the order and the wisdom of creation is an argument for God's existence? It just leads us to God's existence. So on the Christian side of things, again, we should be leading the environmental movement, and if you don't like what the left is doing with the environmental movement, let's blame it on ourselves for not being there to lead them more coherently and correctly.
So you're saying that the left is obsessed with the pollution of the natural environment. If you go to the right, you have an obsession with the pollution of the moral environment, and each side is satisfied with a half-truth as though the half-truth constituted a whole truth.
Yes, and it's going to be painful. I think it's maybe more painful for the left. I sort of have the hope, please God, that we can get Christians to understand this, because the doctrine of nature, the goodness of nature should be one of the central doctrines. God is a creator of nature. He's the creator and redeemer. And so we should be making that move first. But also, again, as you say, the left, it's got half that truth, but it doesn't want to admit that the moral order that Christians uphold is really a natural order. It's not a revealed truth to say that men should marry women. That's, you would think, sort of naturally obvious. Also that, you don't want to kill your unborn or born children. Things like that are appealing to the natural good that we should accept. And the left has to understand that moral order is just as fragile and real and natural and to be protected as the environmental order.
I think it's interesting for maybe this discussion to talk about what natural law is to begin with. A lot of people hear that moniker, not all that certain what it means, what it entails.
Yeah. And boy, yeah, if there's ever a weed bed of confusion, it's the natural law. We have a bad understanding of law. I could probably talk for about an hour on that, so I won't. But we think of it as some kind of an order from somebody. Like, God orders you not to murder, or God orders you not to commit adultery. And what the natural law argues, and this is essential to the history of Christianity, is that the moral order of human beings is rooted in their very nature. It's not something imposed on it. It's something that defines the intrinsic order and perfection of human nature. So do not murder comes from the fact that human beings quite literally are the only rational animal made in the image of God capable of moral actions. So that's what the natural law is. It's not something extrinsic to human beings. It's intrinsic. And unfortunately, there was I guess we, in modern parlance, call it a branding problem. It would have been better to call it something else rather than the natural law, because it sounds like what we today call laws of nature. But in defense of nature, I try to shake people loose from this and talk about trout law, where you could talk about squirrel law, or you could talk about turtle law. And all you would be talking about is, well, what is a turtle? What does it need to live well and perfect itself, and what harms it? And that's all you're talking about with natural law in regard to human beings. What is a human being? What makes it distinct? What makes it flourish? And what harms it? And so in defense of nature, I go through that as if you could, and you can, discover this sort of from an ecological standpoint. You really can uncover the basics of the natural law. Here is a human being. What is good for it as a human being? How do you perfect its nature? What harms it? That's the foundation of the Christian understanding of moral law.
Trout law would probably be a good thing to cash out because it's really easy to understand, but becomes an example of how, when you defy the parameters that God sets forth for us to live within, we reap the consequences.
Yeah, and so let's use the example of a trout. Well, we'll use a freshwater trout. That freshwater trout can't live in salt water. That freshwater trout will actually die if a nearby industrial plant pours hot water into the stream and the temperature rises higher. In the same way that if you raise the temperature around human beings too high, they'll die too. So if I purposely sneak in your house and try to bake you, well, that's against human law. That's against the natural law because it's a harm. And another thing that's interesting, by the way, that's happened to, I don't know whether it's happened to trout, but to other fish, fish are supposed to mate. That's how they get more fish. It's part of their nature to mate. And because so many women have taken the pill for so long, it gets into the streams through our sewer systems and is actually, if I can say this this way, transgendering the fish. That is, the males can no longer mate, and the fish populations are dying out because of that. Now, that's against the nature of a trout. We're violating trout law. And I like that example because every environmentally concerned person must say, well, that's not a good thing. Why? That's a bad thing. That's an example of pollution that harms the nature of this creature. It goes against its nature and causes it not to be able to do something it should be doing, and that is mating. Well, this is weird. We don't think that the pill, and we don't think that sexual transgenderism, and we don't think that sterility purposely caused and so on are violations of the human sexual moral order, even when we find them in nature, and every environmentalist is going to say, this is bad. You shouldn't be dumping these chemicals into the fish. You're ruining their ability to be that kind of a fish. So, again, if we can use those examples, hopefully they awaken the left to moral questions in regard to human beings as well.
Really, what you're pointing out is the connectivity between environmental ecology and ethical ecology.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And in one of the chapters in Defense of Nature, I deal with trash because we create so much of it, but that ties us into questions about economics. That is, are we setting up an economic system which literally causes the defamation, the violation, the profanation of the land, and also poisons the groundwater, and on top of everything else, looks bad. That is, makes creation befouled in front of us. And so that's a kind of pollution, and everyone has to say, well, what else would it be? But I also have a chapter on sexual pollution in which I use all the same terms and talk about how you can measure the harm, and it's not just some kind of vague moral thing that Christians made up. It's we can literally see that our sexual activities are causing a kind of pollution of human nature. So when you can see both issues side by side, and you can see that you're using the same kind of analysis, and you can see that scientists are pointing to the harm caused both by our treatment of the environment and to our sexual nature, well, then you see this web of reasoning. It's really one kind of reasoning that we're using, and it's not rarefied. It's not peculiarly Christian. It's something that's available to everyone as a foundation for which we can hopefully begin a reasonable public debate on these things.
You know, let's go back to this idea of the big business of garbage. I know it's sort of personal to you because of where you live and what you've experienced where you live. And I don't really know how to cash all of this out, but you think about New York, and New York's garbage suddenly disappears mysteriously, but it ends up somewhere. And so, as you pointed out, there's a trickle-down trash effect that's going on around the world, and recycling is not what we think it is, and perhaps doesn't really work in the way we think it works.
No, I'll deal with the trash aspect first. As you say, this is personal for me. It still actually is. In the book, In Defense of Nature, I talk about my experience. We lived out in a cabin in the woods, and it was so wonderful. And here, not a mile down the road, these enormous train loads, 100-car train loads of trash were coming in and parking there, waiting to get into the landfill that was a few miles away. And it smelled awful. And that wasn't our trash. Okay, granted, I contributed some trash to that, but what's actually happening, and this happens all over the world, is that the rich or places in the city places, like New York City, are transporting their trash elsewhere. So it looks like it magically disappears, and it's not a problem. And what they don't have to face is how much junk, how much waste they produce. And I tweak New York because it is obviously a liberal center, an intellectual and social center, but they have no cause for self-satisfaction because we here in Ohio simply receive all of their trash. And that's sort of a morally bankrupt position because they're not being honest about what they themselves are doing. Even where we are now, we smell another landfill when the wind's right, and the wind's right all too often because they're concentrating trash in such enormous, tonnage in this area. So what you find is that the rich places who love to spout off about how wonderful they are actually sending their trash to the poor places, to the places where People are out of work. They have areas that people don't care what you do with them, and we're the ones suffering for it. So you've got that awful situation where the moral effect of what you're really doing isn't visible to you, and that's not good. It's a lot like we don't see what's going on in those factories over in China or India or elsewhere where they're making our super inexpensive clothes. But that's not morally defensible, and think how much of the Old and New Testament deals with how you treat the poor. So there you've got a theological aspect to it. So there's so many aspects to the environmental argument, and trash is certainly one of the things that many people overlook because they don't have to deal with it. Now there's another half to your question. Bring that to my mind again.
I can't even remember what the other half of my question was.
Okay, maybe my answer was too long.
No, actually, what I was asking about is the whole issue of recycling. I mean, how does recycling actually work? Because it's really not what we think it is. I mean, you go into the airport and you see the recycling, the differences between the recycling container and the waste container, and we think we have an idea of how this works in some sanitized sense, but it doesn't really work that way.
It doesn't, and this was a really depressing part of the book to research because we've been recycling for years and years and years. We have our little special cans and so on, and we still do it. We still do it. But what causes the need for recycling is that we just consume too much stuff. We just create so much trash, so much packaging, and so on. And it's really expensive environmentally to do that. And it ends up in landfills. Now, it might seem like we'll just recycle everything. And so we put it in a little box, and then I put it in the recycling bin, and I feel better. And I still do. I can still trick myself. But as you're pointing out, the sad news is that recycling only pays if you've got really poor people on the other end who dig through the stuff and sort through it, usually in very bad conditions. Now, there are some recycling plants in the United States that are better than that, but most of the recycling that we do, you can talk about electronics, like your computer, your phone, all that stuff, they're sent back to China because we don't manufacture anything for China. They manufacture everything for us. They send over these big ships full of goods that we buy, but they're empty. And so we overconsume and we don't produce anything. And these ships that the Chinese send over, which had all our goods in them, if they went back empty, they'd actually be dangerous because they need weight in them. So it, oddly enough, pays then to dump all our recycling on the Chinese. So that's where a whole lot of it goes. It's shipped back to China, and if you would look at some of the places in China where they do this recycling, you're talking about the poorest of the poor who sort through this stuff under the worst conditions because that's the only way they can make money. And they are the ones who are doing the actual recycling. It isn't the happy recycling elves. It's poor people. And it doesn't matter what you're recycling. You can see electronics, same thing. Under horrible conditions, they're stripping those electronic devices of anything they can get, usually the precious metals, but they're doing it under conditions which are cheap and hence dangerous and toxic. So if, it's bringing back the J.R.R. Tolkien metaphor. The places they recycle look like Mordor, because literally they're toxified and the people there are toxified as well. So if we actually had to pay for recycling, we'd find out it wouldn't pay. If we actually made sure that everyone did it under conditions that were safe, it wouldn't pay. And the answer isn't to stop recycling and then just have more junk. It's we need to look at the way we consume so much and why so much comes in so much packaging. Recycling isn't the answer. It's what you do when you haven't yet looked at the question.
What's really interesting about this discussion is you think about something that we celebrate every year, like Lent. And you make a point of this. I think it's something that we ought to add to the discussion. What would happen if we consumed only what we needed to consume in order to be healthy? So we go on a fast that's really good for us. If we did that, there would be attendant consequences in all kinds of ways, including economic.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what that shows us is that you can really build an economy around your vices, as it were. In other words, around not having virtue. So I do this exercise pretty much on a yearly basis with my students. When Lent rolls around, I ask them just the question you ask: what would happen if I'm not talking about starving, I'm talking about you only eat the foods that are good for you, and you eat natural foods. That is, you don't eat a bunch of processed foods, but you eat actual things that grew in the ground or close to it. What would happen? Well, one of the things that would happen is an economic chain reaction, which would cause vast mayhem. And what that tells us is that we have figured out a way to have what Plato called a feverish economy, where our overconsumption is actually the thing that runs the economy. And, think, as one of the things I tell the students, well, what would happen to the guys that make Doritos in Dorito bags and all the soft drinks and the plastic containers the soft drinks go into? What would happen to all those, high-calorie, high-processed foods in the store? They would just sit there, and you have an economic backlash, and you wouldn't be creating as much trash. So what about the poor trash people? Are you going to be laying off people there? What about if people suddenly became healthy simply by eating healthy food and exercising? The entire diet industry would collapse. How many doctors would be out of work? Because people really wouldn't need a doctor that much. So one of the things that we have to ask, and again, this is a question not that I'm bringing up, this is as old as Plato who brings it up, is what happens when you find out that your economy, your entire way of life, is really built up on what amounts to certain kinds of vices, like gluttony. We just eat too much. And our obesity rates, not just in the United States and worldwide, are through the roof. We have all kinds of health problems because of it. So it's not like it's innocuous. We're suffering for it. But we have an economy built upon our not doing the right things. And a sign of that is if we do act well, act temperately. That's the virtue that is essentially involved in taking in food. We find that we destroy or nearly destroy the economy. Then we have to ask ourselves those questions that are hard. Well, how should we be making our economy set up? And we realize, well, gosh, in our little experiment, we certainly created less trash. That was helpful. We became more helpful. But we also threw all those people out of work. So what are we going to do? Are we going to make sure that people have a lot of work by destroying ourselves? Or are we going to figure out a radically new way to live?
We are the number one obesity nation, and we used to talk about years ago the population bomb and how there wasn't going to be enough food to feed people, and now it turns out that obesity is the biggest problem.
Yeah, that's a really weird irony, and we did that. We have, in order to meet what we thought was the worldwide need for food, we're actually engaged in all kinds of overproduction of foods. And historically, I didn't put this in the book, but it's interesting that historically the snack food industry was literally invented to absorb the excess food that we were producing. So what are you going to do with all that extra sugar and wheat and everything else? Well, you just invent food that people eat over and above what they have to eat to preserve their bodies well. So it's a really odd situation And as you say, the obesity rates are, and I have not charts, but information on that in the book, are really embarrassing. And they're evidently self-destructive. Nobody can pretend that it's good for us to destroy our health by eating bad food. It can't be. And this is another way that the natural law arises again. You don't have to become a Christian to see that overeating is a bad thing. It's not good. But that is one of the four cardinal virtues, again, is temperance. And temperance deals with eating the right amount of healthy food and not eating the things that harm you. So, interesting enough, science is discovering the need for virtue, one of the very virtues that Christianity has been telling us for 2,000 years that you need. Well, science has finally caught up with that. And the same would be true for temperance in relationship to sexuality, and so on and so on and so on. In other words, the interesting thing is when we really look at the ill effects that we're having, we can realize, well, what would be the good thing to do? And we rediscover the Christian moral tradition.
So there's a direct correlation between the empire of waste and the seven deadly sins that are talked about in Scripture.
Yeah, yes. Well, one of them is, obviously, gluttony, but it's also avarice. If these people know, and I have a section on this in the book, how to create foods that are almost literally unable to be resisted. That is, they have the character of an opioid, that is, something that causes addiction. And there's an actual science of it. Now, that's a misuse of science. That's a misuse of our intellect. It's a misuse of our intellect, and it's an immoral misuse. That is, the industries are knowingly creating food that they realize will cause bad habits, which are exactly what an addiction is. And the reason is there's big money in it. So, as I point out once in there, the reason that McDonald's and so on love soft drinks is they have the highest profit margin. And so they want to sell you, I don't know what it's called, the big gulp. It's like a third of a gallon of this stuff. And you think, who would drink that much water? There would be the big drown. Yet, people are just sucking these things down. Well, they're awful for people, and the people that sell them know they're awful. The result is that people have simply, they become addicted to having soft drinks or to highly sugared processed foods. So, and the industries know that. So, well, that's one of the seventh deadly sins, as you point out. That's greed. That's avarice. They're making millions and millions of dollars. And again, I think the left understands this. They know about it. They say things like this all the time. But when they do that, what they're admitting is there really is something called vice. There really is something called sin. There really is something that by nature you can say, this is bad to do this to people. But if you live in a meaningless universe that's just been constructed by chance, that doesn't really have any bite to it. So they've got to admit that there's an intrinsic morality to the universe, and you're starting to get dangerously close to admitting there's a moral designer of the universe if you do that, which is fine with me.
You sort of alluded to this, but there's a word that you use, and I don't know if you coined the word, but I have heard you use the word hyper-palatability. Talk about that word, what it means, and how it relates to, let's say, the Lay's commercial, you just can't eat one of these, or
you can't do it. Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't coin it. It took me a long time to learn to spell it, actually. I couldn't figure out but in the literature, it's an actual scientific term. And it refers to the level of palatability is the fact that food tastes good, and so you want to eat it. And that's not something that is just intrinsic to human beings. All the animals that eat something like what they eat. That is, it tastes good to them, and if it didn't, they wouldn't eat it. So it's a way to get us to eat. It's a built-in way to get us to eat, and your body, your taste sensation realizes when something is palatable for you. So palatability is a good thing. Now, what's happened is that human beings have been able to create hyperpalatability. That is a taste that is so incredibly intense that it's literally unnatural and goes beyond what you would find in any kind of a natural food, and then it removes the nutritional substrate. Like, it's all taste and no nutrition. Whereas an apple is palatable, a good one, not these awful ones you sometimes get from the supermarket, but a good apple, it tastes good and it is good. So the nutrition and the tastiness are united. Well, we figured out, clever folks that we are, how to take the tastiness out of it and then intensify it beyond a natural level, so that, again, it quite literally, it takes hold of our pleasure system in our brain and causes us to crave that super intense, hyper-palatable taste. So when you say, gosh, I just have to have a brownie or whatever it is, it is really a kind of addiction because of what it does to the pleasure center of your brain. And so that's what the industries are trying to do, to get you to want to eat or drink as much of their product as possible. And they know also that because they're generally lacking in nutrition, you won't get full. That is the part of your brain that says, I've finally gotten my nutrition, says, well, you've eaten a whole bag of Doritos, but I still need I still need my nutrition. And our response is, well, I guess I'll eat another bag of Doritos, and you're not getting anywhere. So you're getting all taste and no nutrition. And again, they're morally responsible for having done that. And no other animal has that capacity. All the other animals eat what is good for them, and hence you don't see them waddling around, barely unable to walk. So unless they get a relationship to human beings and start eating the hyperpalatable food. But this hyperpalatability is a principle that is also used in pornography. It's also used on the Internet. That is, make the images so that you can't not click on them. So a lot of flashing images, a lot of sexual images and so on. Something so that human beings, the pleasure center wants another hit and another hit and another hit. So what we've done is we have violated natural goodness by trying to take the pleasant aspect of our nutrition out of its natural context and just focus on getting as much pleasure as possible. Now, again, that violates the virtue of temperance. Temperance is trying always to unite your desire for pleasure with what's actually good for you. And what we have done is we made a set of industries that make enormous amounts of money, knowing they are harming us by the vice of intemperance in regard to food, or if we want to talk about pornography, in regard to sexuality. In both places, you have the same problem.
Yeah, I wanted you to make that connection even more stridently or in a stronger fashion, the connection between palatability and pornography.
Yes, it's, pornography it does something that's parallel to taking the sweet out of the apple, leaving the apple behind, just focusing on the sweetness as just the pleasure that you get from it. Well, what pornography does is it takes sexual pleasure away from the union of a male and female in marriage, and even from a relationship to a male and a female in real life, and focuses simply on the pleasure. And it intensifies it to an ever greater degree. That's why pornography over the last 20 years has gotten more and more unnatural. That is, in order for the brain to have its pleasure center excitable, it can't get the same old, ordinary thing. It has to get something something extraordinary. And if you keep feeding it extraordinary things, hyperpalatable things, then it will become addicted to those things. And so what happens in pornography is a continual search for an ever greater hit in exactly the same way it happens with heroin or cocaine. That's why they never stay on just a little high level. So what you have is the creation of sexual addiction in regard to pornography that is driven by going to ever more unnatural depths to create the high, the hit that the porn addicted person is looking for. And of course, the folks that sell it know that. And it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. So the same thing goes as for the food industry as the porn industry. They're hijacking the pleasure center of the natural human brain and getting it addicted to unnatural forms of pleasure that are measurably self-destructive.
So I have mantle cell lymphoma, and there's a connection likely, although I can't make the connection, between many cancers and what we eat.
Oh, yeah.
And the same thing is true, as you're describing right now, with respect to pornography. So pornography causes all of these unintended side effects, maybe intended side effects, and now you have another industry. So you have a $100 billion cancer industry that needs to be fed. Now we have a new industry. We got the ED industry. So people have been addicted to pornography as a result of that. They now have ED. Now you have a new industry. And it seems in some way that we don't want to solve the problem, because if we did solve the problem, we'd have economic chaos.
Yeah, and think if everyone tomorrow, I'd love this economic chaos, if everyone tomorrow could shut off the porn and think, what is my sexual health? What am I as a human being? And begin to rebuild our natural sexuality from becoming so unnatural. There are so many industries tied to it. So much money is made behind the scenes by it's not just Hollywood, and it's not just shady porn makers in a back room. It's just all over the map. Like some of the biggest hotel chains are also the biggest makers of porn. So it's all over the map. As you see, once again, if we return to sexual health, billions and billions of dollars in the economy would dry up, and just like the food industry, you would see the economic effect. Now that's the punishment we deserve. This is what you get when you set up your economy on sins. Well, if you don't believe in sin and you don't believe in God, then the question of, well, why can't you set up your economy in any way you want? Isn't the economy just about everyone making as much money as we can? Well, we are making a lot of money. It's not like we're not. That part's working, but we are making it so feverishly on overconsumption, on sexual self-destruction, and on physical self-destruction. That's not a good sign, and that's not a healthy economy if it's destroying our bodies or our marriages. One of the biggest destroying factors of marriage right now is pornography, but it's destroying maleness as well. And women are going to be hit hard with this. They already are. You can't find a man who isn't addicted to pornography, and hence isn't asking of you. Even if he decides to ask you out for a date, a lot of men are just say, "We don't need women. We're just our pornography is enough. We don't need a real woman. Real women are bothered." A lot of that is happening in significant numbers, but also the toxification of sexuality, so that if men and women are dating, the men, young men too, teenagers, they want the reenactment of porn, which is horrifying and destructive and unnatural. It's not even porn has been so turned from even natural sexuality that the things that they show and dwell on are simply harmful, and that is invading the world where men and women used to meet to marry. And that's a toxification too. And women are starting to complain about it, but women are also becoming more and more addicted to porn themselves, perhaps in part because they can't find any men that they would even have anything to do with.
I want to get back to that in a second, because there are some questions that are brewing in my mind in this regard. But I don't want to forget something that I want to talk about with you, and that is the labeling we have on food packaging. I go to a health food store and I buy organic foods and all natural on the labels, organic on the labels, and so forth. In many ways, this may be misleading.
Unfortunately, it is. It's getting to the point where if you didn't grow it, or you didn't know the person that grew it or produced it, then you don't know whether that label means anything or not, because you can be assured that the food industries have found ways to get around that. So if it says that it's all natural, well, what does that mean? Often you find out it doesn't mean a whole lot. Zero, I remember just 0% trans fat, but what else is in it? So even a lot of the organic produce you may get, unless it's grown locally, has been sprayed with things that you really wouldn't want to ingest, but are allowable under the guidelines. And then you just have people who are selling the stuff, and it's not real at all. That is, it isn't any more organic than anything else you get. It doesn't have any less toxic sprays on it, but they're quite literally selling it, knowing that it isn't, so they can charge a higher price. My wife showed me this horrible article revealing that the FDA had looked at a lot of these extra supplements in all the big stores. So all the things that you think you're taking for health actually don't have the thing they say in them. And this is all, Walmart, all the big chains for drugstores. So what you've got is an economy in which people are selling products which people who want to eat healthy food, want to have good supplements, are buying, but they're simply buying the same old thing and they're paying more for it. Now, that tells us something else about the economy. When we have an economy built on far-awayedness, you can't do that. You need to have local economies, so you know the people and know how they produce what you want. But now, things are shipped in from all over the place. They could have done anything to it, and you don't know. So it doesn't even guarantee it if it says this is organic or this is all natural in the label. You have no idea. And as you say, that's not very funny when you're trying to avoid all the carcinogens that are pumped into the food.
Interestingly enough, you have this predilection to get people involved in nature once again. I mean, we're looking at computer screens. We're addicted to being inside homes, and we're losing touch with nature itself. And there seems to be a connectivity between the fact that we really don't know, or maybe something like even sludge as fertilizer. I mean, we don't know about these things because we're looking at computer screens, we're indoors, we really don't know how the world works anymore. We don't know nature.
Yeah, and somebody might think, oh, well, you're just talking about the general run of the mill here, most people. And as I point out in defense of nature, no, it's actually scientists who are part of this, because science itself used to be studied as actually going out into nature and looking at animals in their habitat, knowing about birds, knowing about the way actual ecologies work, stamping through the fields. Now it's become, over the last, say, 30, 40, 50 years, basically an indoor activity done on the computer screen, manipulating computer programs, or simply believing that the only thing that nature really is a set of chemicals that are put together in different forms. So everything's really reducible to DNA, so you don't need to study actual fish or birds or elk or antelope. You don't need to get actual environmental systems. You simply reduce everything to the effect of DNA. So there's our natural science itself has become not very natural at all, and that's because it's bought into the materialist reductionist view. The nature out there really isn't real anyway. It's all reducible to molecules and atoms. It's not real. So you have it in science, and you have this kind of abstraction of nature in our daily lives, and it's become epidemic over the last 50 years, certainly over the last 10 with computers and cell phones, but it began with the television. And so I had to confess my sins in the book, and I couldn't pretend to be the guy that was always out in nature when I was a kid. I was watching the television all for hours and hours and hours, and the result was that I didn't know anything about nature. I was abstracted, but the internet is 1,000 times more intense than that, and we now have a serious amount of scientific literature, much of which I include in defense of nature, on internet addiction. It's not just porn addiction. That's one thing. This is just, I can't get off the internet. I'm always on my phone. I'm always on Facebook. And the world could be crumbling outside of you and you wouldn't even know. And that abstraction from nature is, in a very important way, if I can say this, a Christian heresy. Because creation is the good foundation of revelation. Creation is good. It is the place that we meet God on the natural level as the Creator, and both enjoy and praise His works. If we're always in a computer game, we're always staring at a computer, we don't have that natural religious appreciation of creation. And environmentalists want to say the same thing too. A lot of them have. We're addicted to the screen. We're not going out into nature. And hence, we don't care what happens to nature. We don't care at all. As long as we get our Doritos and we get our, computer games, we don't care what happens to it. So, again, here's some common ground between the left and the right, between Christians and a largely more secular mindset that affirms strongly environment. We need to become immersed once again in nature and in human nature. We're part of creation too that we're abstracted from. We have lost sight even of ourselves.
What do you make of this mad rush into gender fluidity?
Well, think about it. If you spend all your time on a computer, you think that you can manipulate anything to create anything. I mean, that's what you do on a computer, and you visually can literally make one universe, or you can transform something into something else. Okay, well, you also live in a culture in which you believe that at bottom, there's no real natural order except the chemical order. And so, bodies are made of chemicals in certain kinds of order, and organs and so on. We can manipulate those as well. And so the belief that there's no natural order, even for human sexuality, is the foundation of our attempt now to say, well, there isn't a natural order of sexuality. Sexuality is what you make it just like we can make things in our computers any way we want, we can use our computers and our understanding of chemical biology and any of our other sciences that would be of help to literally make ourselves any gender we want. And so the notion that our gender is fluid is part of this larger belief that nature itself doesn't have an order and we could do anything we want with it. Now, the good news is, I hope, if we can get him to see this, the left doesn't really believe that about nature. They want to say, wait a second, you can't just do whatever you want. Nature has its own order that you shouldn't violate. And you don't generally see the left and the environmental movement saying that gender is whatever animals want it to be. They realize that it's really the foundation of their being able to live and carry on their species. So it's, oddly enough, very definite in the animal world, but we're trying to make it indefinite in the human world. And that should be an obvious, it should appear to the left as an obvious contradiction, but it yet hasn't, because they want to carry out the full sexual revolution, and that means that you should be able to define gender as well. And that's what's going on.
I've always wanted to talk to you about climate change. We hear so much about CO2. It's a pernicious, evil, destructive force. We have to do whatever we can to combat it. Is that really true with respect to CO2?
Well, I'm going to tell you a dirty secret. I've been exhaling for this whole interview. And I'll bet on your end you have that dirty secret as well. Yeah, and weirdly enough, the plants outside, probably my tomato plants, are inhaling a lot of CO2 as they photosynthesize. So they're oddly enough cleaning that up. So I think we're probably about even here, and that's a lesson in where CO2 really exists naturally. That is, it isn't just a global greenhouse gas. It's essential to carrying on life. It's not a toxin. I live in an area of the country in which downriver on the Ohio River, they belch toxins in the air. Sulfur dioxide, that's a toxin. That's pollution. But CO2 is not pollution. So it's a misrepresentation to pretend that it is. Secondly, the question of CO2 as a greenhouse gas, I put this in an entirely new context in defense of nature. I hope, for heaven's sake, someone will listen to it, is that if you really look at the argument about CO2, it's this. The problem with CO2 in the atmosphere is you got to get it just right. If you have too little, then it will be too cold on the Earth. If you have too much, it'll be too warm. So it's just rightness. And what we find out is that just rightness of the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere is something that allows our planet to be habitable for complex life. And now this begins to sound like the strong anthropic argument. And I treated this in Meaningful World as well. That shows you that all the way back to the Big Bang and all the way down to the way our planet works, you've got wonderful but delicate, complex order that really couldn't have been as a result of chance, because it's so wonderfully precise. And the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere is very small, something like 0.04%, not even 1%. And what the global warming people are saying is, well, gosh, if it rises much higher, we're going to cook. And I want to take that seriously, because it's true. If you could raise it really, really high, we would cook. And a sign of this is Venus. The planet Venus has like 96% CO2 in its atmosphere, and it's very unpleasantly hot there. But we have a small amount in our atmosphere, and it's regulated by so many other things, so many other parameters, so many other aspects of the Earth's wonderful biosphere, that the question of whether we can cause it the greenhouse gas CO2 to increase so much that we boil to death is an open question. Yes, let's argue about it. But weirdly enough, the Earth has a kind of a thermostatic control that washes CO2 out of the atmosphere when too much gets there. Very simple, beautiful. It rains. I mean, that's what causes CO2 to wash out of the atmosphere. If it gets hotter, and you have too much CO2 in the atmosphere and it gets hotter, it rains, it washes it out. And that's what keeps the Earth's temperature stable. So what I don't like about the global warming folk is they pretend that, first of all, CO2 is a kind of a toxin, and secondly, that there's nothing else that contributes to a stable thermostatic equilibrium in regard to our temperature, so that even putting a little more CO2 in the atmosphere is going to bring us over the brink. That's not true. So standing back from the whole fight about global warming, we can take seriously the question about whether there is global warming, but we need to bring in all of the information. And I think that the left can be blamed for not allowing that information to in the conversation. If you don't agree that we're on the brink of disaster, you're not allowed to talk. And that's not scientific, that's not rational. So I'm not dismissing global warming at all, but saying, we need to have a wider, deeper talk about it. And I think the global warming chapter is the longest one in the book because it's such a touchy issue.
It is a touchy issue, and I think back to, I was born in 1950s, so this was fairly current. I guess I was in my 20s when I was reading about the looming ice age.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether we shouldn't be more concerned about a looming ice age today than we are about global warming.
Well, one of the things that they don't want to talk about, the global warming enthusiasts, is that, for example, their large-scale climatic cycles that have been going on for hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. So, for example, we pretty much have a predictable cycle of 100,000 years of ice ages, and then you have like 10,000 years of warming period. And we're in a 10,000-year warming period now. In fact, we're coming to the end of it. Well, if you look at the cycles, and not just the last 100 years of temperatures like they tend to do, but let's look at the last 8 million years of temperatures. Well, then you see these big, large-scale variations, and it looks, when you look at that, as if we're about to enter another ice age, and you add to that variations in regard to the solar energy output, that is from the sun, and it looks like we're about to go toward what's called a Maunder minimum, which means simply that you have so little sunspot activity that it's like entering a mini ice age. And we're seeing some predictions that might be like something like 1930. Or no, sorry, not 1930, 2030. That we might hit another minimum, and then we would repeat a kind of ice age, the mini ice age, that gripped Europe after the Middle Ages up until like the 1700s, where it's really cold, not to the point where I'm going to have a glacier come through Ohio, but the summer seasons are going to be short enough that we could have crop failures, as they did during the mini ice age after the Middle Ages. So if you try to bring in those things, unfortunately, in the debate, you're shouted out as some kind of an irrational, immoral being. Well, that's no way to carry on a discussion that's basically scientific. Everything I said is scientifically verifiable, or at least should be part of the debate. And if these things are true, then the exact opposite will result. That is, we're actually about to enter a colder period in which more CO2 would be beneficial. Now, CO2, again, is not a pollutant, so that's not a problem, but this is an open debate. If we can keep it open and not scream at each other, that'll be a lot better.
I'm sure we're going to have another discussion somewhere down the line, but I can't help but ask you a question about a book that you autographed to me many years ago. 10 books that screwed up the world. I mean, obviously, a discussion on that book would take another couple of hours, but at least a little overview from you for those listening in, I think it'd be very helpful.
Yeah, that's it's happily one of my most popular books, and it was an attempt to get people to understand that ideas have consequences, and a lot of the problems that we experience now have to do with bad ideas that entered, as it were, sort of the intellectual mainstream centuries ago, and have come to fruition in ways that are destructive. So I'm just going to quickly name some of them so hearers can know what kinds of things we're talking about. So I look at Machiavelli's The Prince, which was written in the beginning of the 1500s. And he's the first great modern atheist, and he's the first one to understand what that meant. It meant there is no good and evil, and you can do whatever you want. Well, he's the great founder of the 20th century totalitarian movements, that there's no God, and so all that matters is power and how effectively you use it. Hundreds of millions of people died because of that. That's a toxic idea. So René Descartes' Discourse on Method, he was the one that argued that we should root certainty in the human intellect itself rather than in nature. Well, you can see, just to link it to something we talked about just a bit ago, it's really what happens when we follow Descartes. You create a culture in which you're sort of staring at yourself and your own creations all the time, and you believe that you're the source of order and certainty in the universe. Well, that's dangerous. It's dangerous for the environment if you think you can do whatever you want to the environment, or if you can do whatever you want to human nature. We got Hobbes' Leviathan, another one, Rousseau's Discourse and the Origin and Foundations of Inequality Among Men. He's really the great-grandfather of both the sexual revolution and Marxism. So I deal with Marxism as well, Marx's Manifesto of the Communist Party. I deal with Mill's Utilitarianism, Charles Darwin's The Descent of Man. Everyone should read that book, by the way, because Charles Darwin is really founding the modern eugenics movement in that, and in his own words, and I quote him extensively so people can see, yeah, that's where it came from. And one of the places that it bore fruit was, or several of the places, other books I deal with, Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, Margaret Sanger's The Pivot of Civilization, all in one way or another deal with the belief that there isn't any good and evil intrinsic to things. There is just a future that we make by eliminating the weak and allowing the strong to breed. And that comes right from Darwin. So I deal with several others, but that's sort of an overview of the ones that I deal with that were immensely influential in distorting the culture.
I actually met you as a result of A Meaningful World, How the Arts and Sciences Reveal the Genius of Nature. So I want to end this dialogue with you by just another touch of this. I mean, we live in a meaningful world, but all the while there are scientists that are speculating that the Earth is an insignificant speck of soil aimlessly adrift in a meaningless universe, and that has dramatic ramifications on how individuals live their life in the world at this present time.
Yes. I mean, it's basically pseudoscience-based nihilism. And when people take it seriously, there are no limits to their actions. In other words, look, life is meaningless anyway. If there's going to be any meaning or order or good and evil, I'm going to create it. I'm going to make what I want. And there aren't any real limits to that. So it creates a kind of nihilism, but also one which violates nature and human nature and disregards any kind of moral limits. So it's not innocuous. And the problem with it is not only that it's harmful, but it's scientifically false, that it actually harms our intellect to believe it, because it's not true. And in Meaningful World, I wrote this with Jonathan Witt, we go through the sciences and show, in fact, the truth is, what science reveals is that the universe is wonderfully, deeply intelligible on level after level. And what that means is that it must be that it has an intelligent source. You don't get that many layers of intelligibility of a world quite literally set up so that human beings can understand it and think then that the universe happened by chance. It's not possible, and it's irrational to believe it. And so what I hope in the Meaningful World, in writing this book, was we can reconstruct science so that it's better science. It's deeper science, and it discovers more, and it shows us in ever greater detail how meaningful, how intelligible, how wonderfully ordered the world is. Now, that certainly supports Christianity, but notice it's a scientific argument. I never had to go outside of science to make it, but it shows once again that nature supports revelation.
So I guess the final thing I want to talk about, and maybe this is a summation to our discussion, is we've kicked over the can of worms and we see all of the problems. And so often I say on the Bible Answer Man broadcast and elsewhere that the real problem ultimately is not the pagan world, because pagans are simply exercising their job description. What else would they do? The real problem is Christians not being salt and light. And so in light of that, maybe a couple of words to those listening in about how we should live in the present circumstances that we find ourselves in.
Wow. I think I can answer that in a short enough way. The situation we're in, first of all, has to be understood deeply. One of the things that I find again and again is, and I find it myself too, is I didn't really understand the situation, and so I was contributing to the problem rather than to the solution. So one of the first things I tell my students is, I know you guys are revved up. I teach at Franciscan University. They are revved up with a new evangelization. But I tell them, don't just do something, stand there and listen and read and clarify the actual situation that we're dealing with. Because what you often find is that they mix and match Christian notions and beliefs with what were really originally anti-Christian notions and beliefs, because the culture is so malformed. And so one of the first things we have to get is far greater clarity about it. You know, what we live in a culture largely defined by anti-Christian assumptions. We need to understand that deeply, and then we need to understand what are the Christian arguments and assumptions before we do anything. Otherwise, we might be very well doing the wrong thing. Even our charity may not be real charity if we're doing the wrong thing out of just ignorance. So the first thing is we have to literally clean up our intellectual landscape and also our moral landscape, all the while evangelizing by how we treat ourselves and others. That is, Christians always have the awful burden, which I feel every day. You can't just have the right arguments. You have to live the right arguments. And if you don't live the right arguments, then nobody's going to believe the theological and moral arguments you make. So, again, as with the Christians in the pagan world, we have to be the light, quite literally, in the culture. As the culture gets darker and darker, shine forth all the more.
Benjamin Wiker, he has written some of my favorite books, 10 books that screwed up the world. It's at the top of the list, A Meaningful World, How the Arts and Sciences Reveal the Genius of Nature, In Defense of Nature, The Catholic Unity of Environmental, Economic, and Moral Ecology. And then your latest work is what again?
It will be coming out, as I say, I think in August 28th, and it is called The Reformation 500 Years Later, 12 Things You Need to Know.
I can't wait to read that book. And remember, every single discussion with people like Benjamin Wiker can get out to the broad public when you get involved yourself, not only by listening, but subscribing, rating, reviewing, and most of all, sharing. So there are easy ways for you to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Christian Research Institute by letting people know about the Hank Unplugged podcast. We want to put this podcast in the top of the religion and spirituality platform on iTunes and elsewhere. So please be involved in the process. And Benjamin, thank you so much for the work that you do, for the time that you've spent with us, and for the difference you're making for time and for eternity.
Well, I certainly appreciate it, and it is always an honor to be on your show. It is one of the best, and it deserves to be at the top. And so I'm hoping and praying that we'll be there very soon.
Nice talking to you. We're out of time for this edition of Hank Unplugged. Look forward to seeing you next time with more.